Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning into another Super Tease video, and I've got another round of class updates. In this one, we'll be going over Death Knight, Hunter, Monk, and Rogue, all specializations, and this recent round of tweaking. So I'm going to start looking into what's getting nerfed, what's getting buffed, what does that mean as a result in terms of build options. Do I think that a spec is going to be totally boned moving into Shadowlands as a result of these changes, and how does it really mix things up is the main purpose. And that's the entire purpose of the channel, is to bring these updates to you as quickly as I can. So if that interests you, definitely consider subscribing to the channel. I have tier lists, class recommendations covering all topics and aspects of World of Warcraft, and I'm trying to be a one-stop shop when it comes to Shadowlands. But let's get started here with the Death Knight, and we'll start with the Blood specialization, the tank specialization, one that in the past has been a very strong Mythic Plus contender, and I mean pretty far in the past when we think back to Legion, as it brought battle res to the table. It was highly durable. It did an insane amount of damage with Bone Storm, and damage output generally tanky enough that you don't die, and then it comes into how much damage do you do, and that's ultimately going to place you at the top when it comes to things like Mythic Plus. In this case, in this round of changes, it looks like Blood has received some pretty big nerfs when it comes to its Soulbind conduits. Blood Bond now, Rune Tap heals you and your party for only 2% of your maximum health, and they've scaled it down to its maximum rank from 15% down to 4.8. And I think that changes like this, where it's like a big dramatic at the end scaling 15 to 4.8, was probably they hadn't decided where they wanted it to be just yet, and this is maybe one of the main reasons why they did delay the expansion. So you're going to see a lot of these big number tweaks towards the tuning ends, and that's right here. This means that a max rank conduit, it used to be 15% of your max health. That's probably too much for your entire party every time you press Rune Tap. Now it's only going to be up to 5%. This also means if you're going to make an alt and come back to the game, you're getting probably more of your power, well, less of your power in this case initially, but you won't be that much far behind somebody who's fully unlocked a Blood Bond, Soulbind conduit, for example. You'd be about half, and it's only a very minor amount. So these types of changes I personally like, because it's going to enable you to have alts. It's going to enable new players to catch up while still giving the player who's been playing for a while a slight edge on advancing their character. So something like this, although it's a nerf for Blood, you're not happy to see a nerf for Blood. Changes along this pattern I'd like to see. Debilitating Malady, Potency Conduit. Blood Boil increases the damage enemies take from your Blood Plague by 1% for 6 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. This one also just got downranked really heavily. Now it's not going to scale up to 10% increased damage, only 2.4, so more Blood nerfs. Blood it's always going to be a really good tank at the start of an expansion because it's got such a high health pool, and it does do good damage with Bone Storm. But to my understanding, Vengeance and even Brewmaster potentially, when we get to Monk, I think are a little bit stronger contenders, at least when it comes to Mythic Plus. I still think that Blood will have a spot, just having a battle res, having good damage, and having a good meat shield. Even though these are nerfs, I think it'll still be a decent tank. Meat Shield, Endurance Conduit. This increases the duration of your dancing rune weapon by 3 seconds. And while active, your parries increase your maximum health buffed at the base to 2%, stacking up to 2 times, so 4% maximum health. But its scaling got cut in half now at its max rank only being 4.8. So this is an example of its initial strength being boosted, but its maximum scale potential being brought down. Nothing really standing out here, just some number tuning. Withering Plague, Potency Conduit. Heartstrike deals 15% increased damage to enemies infected by your Blood Plague. So a little bit of a damage buff to Heartstrike specifically, and scaling it up. Trying to just get the damage output a little bit higher of Blood. So defense brought down quite significantly in the Soulbind conduits specifically, but I don't necessarily know if this will be a bad thing overall for the game, as long as this is a trend that continues for all specializations. Overall, you get a little bit more damage in this recent round. Frost Deathknight, moving down to their Soulbind conduits, we've got Accelerated Cold, Potency Conduit, and Power Rune Weapon takes 10% less time to recharge and grants you a 6%, up from 5% additional haste. The scaling remains about the same, so just a slight buff overall. You're going to get a little bit more haste during your Empowered Rune weapon, during your Breath of Sindragosa, if you're opting to run that build. This is going to make it feel really fluid during your burst window. Frost has been getting a lot of nerfs when it comes to its obliterate damage, when it comes to its burst, and I feel like it's kind of disappointing because I feel like most of the community that played Frost, I'm not personally much of a Frost Deathknight main, but from my observations, I feel like you were pretty excited about the two-handed big crit Frost DK coming back, and I'm a bit worried that's not going to be there ultimately, and this is one of those changes that lowers its potential. Eradicating Blow, Potency Conduit, Obliterate increases the damage of your next Frost Strike down to 6% from 10, stacking up to 2 times, so 12% instead of 20, and its scaling was brought down. So this was likely a Potency Conduit that was being taken in all cases, so they've tried to tweak it down significantly to balance it out with the other options. When it's something that's such a core rotational ability like Frost Strike, you're going to have difficulties tuning that around something that's a cooldown, right? Like Empowered Rune Weapon isn't up the entire time. So to have these end up being the net result of a damage output being the same, the tweaking has got to be really weird. That's why trying to balance these conduits against each other and against each other in all aspects and content style, man, it's going to be really tough to make these things feel good and not have one just outperform the other or one dramatically underperform the other without them losing the fact that they feel good. So this is a pretty big nerf. Everfrost, Potency Conduit, Remorseless Winter now deals 3% up from 2, increased damage to enemies hit. It stacks up to 10 times. So it would be 30% increased damage by its 10 seconds to all of the targets, but its scaling was brought down slightly. Again, your initial damage goes up, your scaling goes down. It's going to be a buff if you're right away. It'll be a damage increase, but over time it may not. Unleashed Frenzy, Potency Conduit, Frost Strike increases your strength by 1% for 6 seconds, only stacking up to 3 times, down from 5, and it's only going to scale up to 2.4% strength, down from 4.5. So overall, some nerfs to your single target, potential buffs to your AoE, if you're going to run an AoE build, so for dungeons and such like that. But this Frost Strike nerf is pretty big for things like PvP or single target situations. Same thing with scaling your strength. Potentially Ice Cap could have been an option in your talents for PvP, but I don't think so with this now being reduced. So not too great so far to be a Death Knight, but we haven't gotten to Unholy just yet. Soulbind Conduit changes for Unholy. Convocation of the Dead, Potency Conduit. When a Festering Wound bursts, the cooldown of Apocalypse is reduced by 0.5 seconds, but it was scaled down dramatically at its max rank. Instead of being 3.5 seconds, left the cooldown down to 1.2. Probably makes sense. At least in PvP, because you can reduce the cooldown of Apocalypse with an Honor talent, and it would be insane to keep reducing it by 3.5 seconds every time you burst a Festering Wound. So I think this scaling overall makes sense, but it is a nerf. This is something that, again, the scaling was likely that this needed to be changed no matter what, so it was kind of inevitable. Embrace Death, Potency Conduit, Sudden Doom increases the damage of your next Death Coil by 35%, reduced by 5% baseline, and its scaling reduced. So Unholy Deathknight nerfs somewhat across the board. Lingering Plague, Potency Conduit. Now, instead of Scourge Strike extending the duration of your Virulent Plague, your Virulent Plague's duration is just increased by 3 seconds, and its damage is increased, so a little bit more straightforward. It doesn't get the gameplay element of like trying to get as many Scourge Strikes into a target as possible. Now it's just more straightforward. Your dot does more damage, and it lasts longer. That's going to be really good in Mythic Plus, really good in Battlegrounds. Maybe not so much in PvP. I feel like reducing the cooldown of your Apocalypse may be better, but it depends on the playstyle because the scaling got buffed dramatically. I mean, this is a really big AoE buff. 24% increased damage for Virulent Plague. That's a big nerf. If you're Unholy DK, I feel like you're pretty happy to see that. This complete rework, and now this could likely be the best thing. Maybe you're not happy because it's still beta, so that might get nerfed back down again. General Soulbind Conduit changes. Abomination Limb, ooh, big nerf there. Increased the damage by 50%. They reduced it to 15% increased damage, and its scaling got gutted down to 36%. That's a big nerf to Abomination Limb specifically. And this is, again, where it comes in. How do you balance Abomination Limb, which has utility tied to AoE damage, when it competes with something like Night Fae, which is just AoE damage and no utility? You have to bring the damage down on the utility one because it has utility as a benefit to balance those two. But if the damage is lower and in PvE you don't ultimately care about the utility, then the one that does more damage is better. And you're going to have a split of Death Knights that want to play Night Fae for dungeons but would have rather been Necrolord for PvP. This is kind of concreting that. Chilled Resilience. Icebound Fortitude's cooldown is reduced by 20 seconds as a base. Its scaling was nerfed overall. This is a really big buff potentially in the late game of Shadowlands for Death Knights. In PvE as Blood, obviously, getting your Icebound Fortitude more frequently to cycle is going to be nice. But in PvP, getting almost a minute off your Icebound Fortitude, I mean, it's going to be really hard to kill a Death Knight through any magic shield, and that significantly of a reduced cooldown Icebound Fortitude. That's a pretty big. It's a nerf overall. It's like a 5-second nerf overall because it's 5 seconds increase from its base. I feel like it's a buff because it's more time initially. Because we're not going to get to this point until I would imagine the end of the expansion. So by the time that this is actually a nerf to this conduit, you'll already have had your fun with its reduction there. Fleeting Wind, Finesse Conduit. Death's Advance grants an additional 15% movement speed over its first 3 seconds. Change from Indicator, Soulbind Conduits, and it scales up to 36. So if you want to sprint from this Finesse Conduit, this is going to make it tough, at least in PvP, where these Finesse Conduits will probably get more play outside of this being a Blood Death Knight. You're going to get more play of this because you have to decide, do I want movement speed? I mean, you get 36% increased movement speed, like a big sprint effect on your Death's Advance, or do you want more defense? And you're going to have the option, it looks like, to build between movement and defense. I think that is a good trade, but usually defense ends up winning out over movement speed. So I would keep my eyes more on things that reduce Icebound Fortitude, reduce damage, than movement speed. But if you wanted to move a little faster as a Death Knight, obviously that's a pretty big problem for your class, so that's now an option. Hardened Bones. Endurance Conduit. While Lichborn is active, the damage you take is reduced by 6%, so buffed at its base. Its scaling looks like it was increased for its initial rounds, but as you get towards the end of it again, it's reduced. So Lichborn will become more of a damage reduction cooldown. And I've been playing my Death Knight more on live realms and enjoying it a lot. And that's obviously without all these Soulbind conduits to increase it. And in PvP specifically with Lichborn, I was able to utilize the old synergies of kind of death coiling yourself for a heal. So getting this as a damage reduction, especially by the end game when it's almost a 15% damage reduction, that's much more significant. At the start, it's not so much. So you maybe at the start of the expansion, Death Knights will focus on movement speed because the damage reduction is too small. But then as you move into the later stages of the expansion, you will want to switch this out in PvP. And then in Mythic Plus, obviously, as Blood getting Lichborn, this is just a nice little extra kind of mini bark skin. So I wouldn't imagine that that's going to be bad for you as Blood. Impenetrable Gloom, the potency conduit for the Venthyr. Swarming Mist's dodge chance is increased by 3%, and its damage is increased by 12.5%. So this looks like a buff overall, as its damage was only increased by 5%. And this is, again, they're trying to balance the covenants that are all very similar with each other, right? So in my mind, Swarming Mist is just AoE damage. The Night Fae, Death and Decay, is just AoE damage. The Abomination Limb is AoE damage. Swarming Mist's advantage is that it gives you dodge. And then the Night Fae one gives you a whole bunch of other benefits. And then the advantage of the Necrolord one is that it pulls targets in. So will they be able to get it to where the damage is equal across the board on all of them? Tough to say. And the thing is, I don't think the gameplay is, aside from Necrolord, for example, between Venthyr and between Night Fae, I feel like the difference of it is not, it's not enough. Now this says 3% and 12.5% damage increase for your dodge. Now, when you scale up to max, does that mean 30% dodge or 30% increased damage? That's a little bit on the table there, because 30% dodge could be really good as Blood as a tank. In PvP, not really. I don't think you're gonna be taking Venthyr or DK for the dodge chance. Insatiable Appetite. Endurance Conduit. Death Strike's minimum healing is increased by 1%. They downscaled the crap out of this one. Likely for Blood, I would imagine. In dungeons, Death Strike is just always been really good, and that's like the core. So your scaling got gutted a lot on that as blood. And then obviously as Unholy and Frost, you care about this in PvP because that's your self-sustainability. I personally like them reducing healing in PvP, but it needs to be equal across the board, right? Like we can't all just dog on DKs, make DKs actually balanced and fun to engage within the game, and then make Ret Paladin's Word of Glory lay on hands and make Feral Druid Regrowth lay on, like it's got to be somewhat equivalent, right? So I don't feel like this was done specifically for PvP, but the implications of PvP I think are good to reduce healing. I hope that this happens with all of the damage dealing specs in the game, so healers feel valuable again. Games in PvP don't last long, well, at least don't last extraordinarily long as they would if your death strike with healing was increased with such a high scaling. But if you're blood, you're unhappy about this. PvP in terms of your power, you're unhappy, but I think overall game pacing, the change like this is good. Proliferation, potency conduit, shackle the unworthy's duration is increased by 3 seconds, and its damage is increased by 20%, and its scaling got buffed dramatically. So really trying to open up Kyrian as an option. Problem with Kyrian is that, again, it's single target competing with 3 AoE options, right? How do you balance that? Just generally, if you can hit more targets, AoE is superior to single target. If you can't hit more targets, then this one ends up being the best single target. So if you go Kyrian and it's a single target raid boss, you're going to parse high there. But in every other part of the game, you're going to be worse, other than maybe tyrannical bosses. But even on tyrannical weeks, it's more important to do trash damage. They buff it to an extraordinary level, and then this is actually pretty close. And then in PvP, you might take it because it's just an insane single target damage over time effect. This is a big buff to Kyrian. Reinforced Shell, Endurance Conduit, Anti-Magic Zone's radius increased by 15%, and its duration lasts now 2 seconds up from 1, or increased duration. But its scaling got cut in half reasonably, so it's now only about, what is that, like a 7 seconds longer. In Raid, that's going to be really good. In PvP, debatable as to whether or not it matters that it lasts this long, because usually it's like the initial upfront cooldown damage trade, and then the cooldown's over, and then it doesn't really matter if you stay in it too long. I think some of the other endurance conduits for your personal survivability and PvP will matter more, but if you're a raiding Death Knight, then this is a good option. Spirit Drain, Finesse Conduit, successfully interrupting an enemy with Mind Freeze grants you 10 runic power. This got buffed, so trying to get more damage out of your play is an interesting little maneuver here. That got a big buff. I could see this in Mythic Plus if you're successfully landing interrupts, able to generate more runic power, as Frost especially during Breath of Cindergosa, or just in general generate on runic power is a nice damage increase. Unending Grip, Finesse Conduit, Death Grip slows enemies' targets, got nerfed down to 20%. It's really strange that they nerfed this one when Death Knight has just Chains of Ice. Like, it seems a bit strange. Like, I personally wasn't even looking at this conduit when I was trying to build my Death Knight, because I already have the best slows in the game. Why do I need my Death Grip to slow? And then they nerfed it. So I'm not even looking at this anymore at all. Is it like a Gorfine's Grasp thing? Did this work on Gorfine's Grasp's blood maybe? Seems strange. Withering Ground, Potency Conduit, Death Dew, so the Night Fae does 50% increased damage up from 15. That's a big swing up. And its scaling got dramatically increased. So some interesting buffs across the board, except Necrolord. So honestly, I feel like if you're a PvP Death Knight, you're kind of a little bit sad about the Covenant changes there, if you were really sold on Necrolord, like I was at least. But if you weren't sold on Necrolord and you wanted to be the other ones, it looks like those are all getting buffed. So let's jump on over. We've got Hunter. We got to get through all of these changes here. We've got PvP talent changes. You just spell dots when you feign death. I think they're just trying to correct this as it wasn't working. For Beast Mastery, you got nerfs. Potency Conduit, Barb Shot's recharge is reduced by math seconds, and its damage is increased by 5%. Its scaling got cut, its base damage got cut, so Barbed Shot not going to be too great as a result of that. Ferocious Appetite, Potency Conduit, which is weird because I feel like, BM competed really well. I guess it is parsing high right now in raids, so it makes sense that they're doing these changes. Ferocious Appetite, Potency Conduit, Kill Command, critical hits, reduce the cooldown of Aspect of the Wild by 1 second. It got buffed up to 4 seconds at max rank. Interesting little change there. You can maybe run the double Kill Command talents, and does it count twice if both kill commands crit? That could be kind of cool. Synergies there. That got a buff. One with the Beast, Potency Conduit. Bestial Wrath increases all of the damage you deal and your pet deal by an additional 1%. Its scaling got reduced. So overall scaling, maybe they're worried about in the future Beastmaster scaling with secondary stats like crit and then bringing down these overall. In PvP, you're not too happy about this because in PvP, Beastmastery is like, it's okay. It's just okay. That's about where it fits. Anyways, marksmanship. Again, we talked about this in the general overview, but Serpent Stalker's Trickery, and now instead of when you fire an aim shot and fires a Chimera Arcane, it now fires a Serpent Sting. So burst damage of this legendary is brought down insanely hard, which does have implications on Mythic Plus Trash, where if the Trash dies before Serpent Sting has a chance to really start ticking on the monsters, you lost damage. In PvP, if you don't just kill someone instantly with the proc Chimera, then this is a damage nerf as well. So not super excited about this legendary now. With it being a damage over time effect, although I understand the justification for that change. Brutal Projections for Soulbind Conduits on Marksman. Your auto attacks have a 10% chance to cause your next rapid fire to deal 3% increased damage for each shot, and its scaling got buffed. But I mean, this is probably a conduit that no one was taking as Marksman, which is why it's getting buffed. But it does seem weird to see Marksman buffs across the board in the game. Deadly Chain, Potency Conduit, Trick Shots, secondary damage is increased by 5%, reduced from 10, and its scaling was reduced. That now makes sense, especially for Mythic Plus Trash. So a little bit of a nerf there for Marksmanship Hunter. Survival Hunter, we've got Deadly Tandem, Potency Conduit, Coordinated Assault's duration is increased by 4 seconds, and the scaling was increased up here. In PvP, that's a big deal. You get your cooldown 11 seconds longer. That might even push you into maybe a second. You get 2 traps during your Coordinated Assault in PvP. Mythic Plus, if you don't play around Coordinated Assault too much in Mythic Plus, when you're just going Trash Pull to Trash Pull, it might not matter too much, but in PvP, that's a big deal. Flame Infusion, Potency Conduit, Carve increases the damage of your next Wildfire Bomb explosion by 5%, stacks with 2 times, and its scaling was reduced. Maybe synergies with the Wildfire Bomb Legendary. This seems like a PvE change. That's a big nerf, though, to your AoE and your burst AoE. Stinging Strike, Potency Conduit, Mongoose Bite, Raptor Strikes, damage is increased by 5%. That got nerfed. That's a big nerf. Scaling by 1/3, base amount by 1/3. I mean, maybe you're happy about this in PvP with Coordinated Assault lasting longer, but this is overall kind of nerfs to survival. Now we've got Flayed Shot. Venthyr got really big nerfs. If you were hoping to be a non-Kyrian marksmanship hunter in PvP, probably that dream is slowly leaving. And this is a big nerf to BM Hunter too. So now you only get 87% of the attack power down from 250. It only does damage for 14 seconds down from 20. And it only has a 10% chance to grant you a kill shot down from 15. And in PvP, kill shot doesn't even really hit hard. I feel like Lightning Bolt hits harder than kill shot in PvP. New Conduit for finesse here. Ambuscade. When a trap is triggered, the cooldown of your disengage is reduced by. That's really interesting. I like that. Marksman and all hunter specs really kind of struggle a little bit with mobility, so encouraging you to utilize all of your traps to try and get your disengage on a lower cooldown, I think is fun gameplay. Mythic Plus, you probably don't care, and PvE, you probably don't care, so it's more of a PvP thing. Cheetah's Vigor. The aspect of the Cheetah's secondary movement speed lasts an additional 3 seconds, and its cooldown is reduced by 16, and its scaling got brought down. So trying to bring the sprint in line. Not really as much gameplay involved as this finesse one was. I think this one's a little more interesting, and these both directly compete as movement ones. I'd almost rather see this Cheetah one deleted because it doesn't really add too much gameplay-wise. It's just, yeah, your cooldown's better. Whereas this one encourages you to utilize your whole kit in a different way, and it's more impactful and meaningful. But yeah, this one got a slight base buff, but its scaling was nerfed. Empowered Release. Potency Conduit. Flayed Shot has a 5% chance to proc Flayer's Mark, and its damage the next kill shot by 5%, and it got nerfed on its scaling, so more Venthyr nerfs. Enfeebled Mark. Potency Conduit. Your attacks and abilities deal 7.5% increased damage to enemies inside Resonating Arrow. Really surprising to see Kyrian buff like that. Maybe this is for PvE, but in PvP, you get more damage. Okay. Resilience of the Hunter. Endurance Conduit. When Feign Death ends, you take minus 3% reduced damage for 8 seconds. And the scaling got buffed, so you'll take 14%. That's really big when it comes to PvP. Also, even in Mythic Plus, if you wanted to have a personal cooldown, let's say there's a heavy hitting damage over time effect applied to you, healer doesn't have an Iron Bark or something, you can Feign Death and it's basically an Iron Bark. So this does have big implications. It seems like a good Endurance Conduit. Let's move forward. We've got Monks coming up next here. We got Brewmaster on the table, and Brewmaster looks like it got buffed quite a lot. Celestial Effervescence, Endurance Conduit. While under the effects of your Celestial Brew, your effects that heal you are increased by 18.8%, and its scaling was increased. Brewmaster may start competing now a little bit more, at least in Mythic Plus, when it comes to Vengeance Demon Hunters. Evasive Stride, Endurance Conduit. During shuffle, Heavy Stagger has a 2.5% chance to heal you instead of dealing damage at 6%. That's still really low. Scalding Brew, Potency Conduit. Keg Smash deals an additional 7.5% damage, and its scaling got buffed. So trying to get some Keg Smash builds going. I love that. Keg Smash is probably my favorite ability on Brewmaster. Walk with the Ox, Potency Conduit. Abilities that grant Shuffle reduce the cooldown on Invoke Newzao. The Black Ox by 0.5, and Newzao Stomp deals an additional 25% damage, and its scaling was buffed. So across the board, Brewmaster got some buffs. For Brewmaster main, you're pretty happy. Mistweaver looks like Elon Soothing Breath Healing is increased by 6.3%. Its scaling was buffed, so Jade Bond and the Red Crane here was buffed slightly. Nourishing Chi, Potency Conduit. Life Cocoon increases healing over time. Effects received by an additional 18.8%. This effect lingers the last 6 seconds longer. Problem with Life Cocoon, at least when it comes to Mythic Plus and high keys, is that it's not damage reduction. So even though you put an Absorb on the tank, when you get really high keys, the Absorb gets cut through and they die. This gives you a little bit of added benefit after it's been cut through immediately, but doesn't really resolve that problem. Mistweaver is still, I think, a good healer at the moment in Mythic Plus. And in PvP, I think it's a solid healer too, although it's not really changed too much. It's basically the same as BFA. Resplendent Mist, Potency Conduit. Gust of Mist has a 30% chance to do 50% more healing, and its scaling was dramatically increased. I think this has negative downsides in PvP because Gust of Mist is just passive healing. So, I mean, this is going to help you out in raids. You're going to be really happy about that. But in PvP, more passive healing you don't think about that just carries you through. I don't like that, but I see why this is buffed for raids. Rising Sun Revival, interesting combination of those two abilities. Rising Sun Kick reduces the remaining cooldown on Revival by 1 second, and Revival heals targets for 12.5% of Revival's heal over 10 seconds, and its scaling got increased. So buffs across the board here for Mistweaver. Now down to Windwalker, Soulbind Conduits, Calculated Strike, Spinning Crane Kicks bonus from striking a unique target with Target Palm, Blackout Kick, or Rising Sun Kick is increased by an additional 10%, and its scaling was increased. Coordinated Offensive, Potency Conduit, Serenity. Serenity's damage bonus increased by 8.8%. After your Storm, Earth, and Fire fixated target, you get 8.8%, and its scaling was increased. Windwalker getting buffed. In PvE, obviously, you're very happy about this. You're underperforming. You've been underperforming for a really long time. In PvP, you're going to be even more nuts. So Monk is pretty happy about these changes, I think, so far. Inner Fury, Potency Conduit. Fist of Fury's damage is increased by 5%, and its scaling was increased. You love that one across the board. That's great. Mythic Plus trash damage, great PvP damage. Zwen's Bond, Potency Conduit. Abilities that activate combo strikes reduce the cooldown of Invoke Zwen and the White Tiger by 0.1, and Zwen's damage is increased by 10%, and the scaling was increased by 24%. Tony the Tiger got even stronger and tastes better as a breakfast cereal. Windwalker's pretty happy about this. Monk's pretty happy about this. Bone Marrow Hops. So Bone Dust Brew is going to do more damage and more healing by 40%. It got buffed. The scaling got buffed. Really trying to make that Necrolord a little bit more appealing. Dizzying Tumble, Finesse Conduit. Targets affected by your leg sweep now deal 6.3% less damage afterwards, up to 15%, trying to increase the viability of this AoE stun. This is really good for trash pulls in Mythic Plus, especially if you're Brewmaster or Windwalker, help out the tank a little bit. And then in PvP, you get the added benefit of killing the target, and then when they're annoyed coming out of the stun, they even do less damage afterwards. So really a good conduit there, and it got buffed. Fortifying Ingredients, Endurance Conduit. Fortifying Brew grants you a shield equal to 12%. Scaling got buffed. In PvP, I really don't like this because, again, I'm not a big fan of DPS specs getting big healing buffs like this. But in Mythic Plus or Raids, as a Brewmaster, I feel like this is a conduit more intended for Brewmaster. This is a great buff. But in PvP, if you're a Windwalker, you're happy with this. You're getting more damage. You're getting more self-sustainability. These are all going to make you really OP, but I don't like these increases to healing ones. Endurance Conduits, I think, are going to be problematic in PvP. Grounding Breath, Endurance Conduit. When you're casting Vivify on yourself, you get 15% more healing from it. And that scaling got increased as well. Buff. Harm Denial, Expel Harm's healing is increased by 25%, and its scaling goes up to 60%. That is insane in PvP. A little bit of nice self-healing for Brewmaster during Celestial Brew with this as well. So the scaling of this later on could be really good for Brewmaster, but this is a massive buff in PvP for Windwalker. Potency Conduits increased to Fallen Order. Oh, excuse me. Okay, in PvP, you're going to do insane damage. But this Conduit, this Covenant in PvP is absolutely bonkers, but in PvE, I feel like people aren't taking it at all. So I understand why it's getting buffed for the PvE aspect of the game, but in PvP, this is like, whoa, okay, buddy. Lingering Numbness, Finesse Conduit. When paralysis ends, you get more of a snare, up to almost basically a root. That's interesting. to use against a healer potentially, or more of as a peel. In PvE, probably just ultimately don't care about this one though. Strike of Clarity, Potency Conduit, Weapons of Order's duration is increased by 5 seconds and increase your mastery by an additional 25%, and its scaling got increased. So just trying to buff up the Covenants overall for the monks and maybe make them more competitive overall in PvE where they're struggling. Swift Transference, Transcendence, transfer increases movement speed by up to 30% at max skill. Get movement speed buffs on your Finesse Conduits. Tumbling Technique, Finesse Conduit, Blackout Kick has a 6% chance to grant a charge of roll up to 14%. Meh. Would you rather take your RNG? I guess maybe. I mean, if you got this right when a healer managed to escape and you procced an extra roll and got to connect to them in PvP, it's really good. In PvE, don't care. I feel like you'd probably just, this isn't even that interesting to you. Way of the Fae, Potency Conduit, Fae Line Stomp deals more damage, up to a maximum of 27% additional damage, and its scaling got buffed. So Monk got buff. All right, let's go to the ones that didn't get buffs. So we got Rogues up on the table here, and Assassination. Ouch. All right, Soulbind Conduits, Lethal Poison, Potency Conduit. The instant damage of your lethal poisons increased by 10% down from 30, and the scaling was going to be 100% down to 24. And I feel like 100% was probably too much, so that was going to happen no matter what. But big nerfs to Assassination. Maim, Mangle, Potency Conduit, Groat increases the damage you mutilate on the target by 9% down from 20, and it's scaling down from 60 down to 23. Poisoned Qatar, Potency Conduit, Fan of Knives damage increased by 7% down from 8, and it has a 5% down from 8 per poison application to have a 5% increased critical strike chance. Scaling got nerfed. Well-placed Steel, Potency Conduit. Shiv increases your nature damage done against the target by an additional 10%, making this a little bit more straightforward of a conduit. These kind of really confusing conduits, maybe they're just making them more straightforward, so this is consistent with some of the other conduit changes that I've seen. Curious to see how it plays out. Its scaling got dramatically reduced. These had to have been placeholder numbers though, right? 300% down to 24%. Not too happy about that if you're Assassination. I feel like Outlaw was performing better in PvE than Assassination. I mean, Assassination was doing good. Maybe that's a raid change. And then in PvP, I don't even think I see Assassination Rogues, so a little bit weird. They kind of got it out of nowhere on their Soulbind Conduits. Maybe that means they'll buff up their base abilities. Who knows? Outlaw, Ambidexterity, Potency Conduit. Main Gouch has an additional 3% down from 10. Chance to strike while Blade Flurry is active. Scaling got nerfed down to 7.2%. I'm not surprised to see nerfs around Blade Flurry with how well Outlaw's doing in Mythic Plus. Count the odds. Flagellation, Slaughter, and Dispatch have a 15%, so a buff here. Chance to grant you a Roll the Bones combat enhancement buff that you did not already have, and its scaling was increased to 36%. I feel like they've been trying really hard to remove a lot of the RNG elements attached to Outlaw and Roll the Bones, so this helps you out, more guaranteeing that you're going to get combat enhancements that you want. So I actually like this change to this conduit. Sleight of Hand, Potency Conduit, Roll the Bones has now a 12% increased chance of granting additional matches, and the scaling was increased. So these two conduits directly around trying to reduce getting really bad RNG on Outlaw, which is good in terms of the quality of play for Outlaw. Triple Threat, Potency Conduit, Sinister Strike only now has a 9% down from 20 chance to strike with both weapons after it strikes an additional time. Not surprised to see something around damage directly being nerfed. So bringing down some of the power of Outlaw makes sense in Mythic Plus. PvP, you're kind of sad about it. And then addressing some of the RNG through Roll the Bones conduits. I think that these conduits make sense. Subtlety Rogue here. Big nerf now. Shadow Strike won't teleport you. It's a melee range ability. So in PvP and in PvE where you enjoy just like, woo, 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 I'm all over the woo. That's not happening anymore. Soulbind Conduits, Deeper Daggers, Potency Conduit, Eviscerate, and Black Powder, which is just Shadow Vault as a talent, your AoE talent, increases your shadow damage dealt to the target by 8% down from 30, and its scaling went from 150 down to 20. Again, this had to have been a placeholder, right? 150%. Not surprised to see nerfs here for Subtlety across the game. Perforated Veins, Potency Conduit, Shadow Strike increases the damage of your next Gloomblade or Backstab by 18% down from 30, but it stacks 6 times rather than 3. So if it was a 3, it would have been 90. 20 times 6. I think it's like overall higher, but it takes longer to stack, but its scaling was brought down. I don't feel like many people were taking this one, at least in PvP. Interested to see how this plays out now that you can stack it so many times. Maybe your sustain will be much higher. But again, in PvE, your single target was already where you were shining. It doesn't get you more damage outside of your dance window, though, and maybe a bit more inside of it as well. Planned not so much, and you're using Shadow Strike inside of it. So this is this damage outside of your Shadow Dance window. Planned execution, potency conduit, symbols of death, increase your critical strike chance only from 4% down from 6, and now it's 9% at max, down from 34. So not surprised to see some nerfs here for subtlety. Covenant abilities, we see Kyrian receive nerfs, Echoing Reprehend now only scaling 110% attack power, only awarding 2 combo points. I think a lot of more rogues were actually running Kyrian, but also Venthyr was kind of like, what's going on with their ability? And then same thing with Sepsis for Night Fae, like what is going on? And then Necrolord is just getting nerfed every time. So the Covenants I feel like are still kind of all up in the air. Flagellation, the Venthyr Covenant, lash the target 3 times, dealing 6% of attack power shadow damage and adding a stack of Flagellation for each lash. The target remains tormented for 20 seconds, receiving an additional lash for each combo point you spend. Reactivating Flagellation cleanses their torment, increasing your haste by 0.5% per stack up to a maximum of 20% haste. And now you lash the target, dealing 6. So it looks like it got buff, but this is a lot of text. So its overall haste was reduced. This is a really complicated set of text. You get more attack power. Doesn't last as long, but probably means you stack faster, and you get less haste. So weird set of changes to Flagellation overall. This is something that I'm gonna have to test out. If you're interested in seeing me test this stuff out, twitch.tv/Supatees. But now Sepsis for Night Fae. I think it's been changed around quite a bit, so you don't get 60 seconds off the cooldown anymore. You only get 30 seconds off the cooldown if it does not last its full duration, so you kill the target. And instead of vanishing, which was a massive buff in PvP, getting access to a bunch of stealth abilities, you're only getting access to 1 stealth ability, which is not nearly as good. And it doesn't scale so well with some of the legendaries. So Sepsis got brought down in terms of PvP utility, but it's a bit more straightforward of just a dot that does damage. These Covenants are directly competing with each other because Flagellation and Sepsis are both just dots you apply to the target. So interested to see how it plays out. And then finally, Soulbind Conduits towards those Covenant abilities. Lashing Scars, Potency Conduit. Flagellation lashes in 2 additional times initially and deals 50% increased damage, and its scaling got massively increased. So, I mean, after all that confusing what is happening to Flagellation, this Soulbind Conduit maybe makes it a little bit more clear that it's looking good. Septic Shock, Potency Conduit. Sepsis' damage over time is increased by 80%, reduced by 10% each time it deals damage, and its scaling got a little bit of a buff. Sudden Fractures, Potency Conduit, Serrated Bone Spikes Bleed, has a 30% chance to deal its damage additional second time, and its scaling was up to 70%, so you get double ticks on that. Now it's a little bit hard. Like, what Covenant are we going to go to? This really kind of rolled the bones for which Covenant is going to be the best for Rogue. I'm going to have to test this out a lot, but that's going to conclude the changes here for Rogues. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave the video with a like, comment down below with your thoughts as far as the changes for your specs, what you'd like to see moving forward towards Shadowlands release. Again, if you like this type of content, you're interested in staying up to date with all the changes, subscribe to the channel. It's absolutely free, and I will have links to videos for class recommendations and tier lists across the entire board of World of Warcraft. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.